The rogue prosecutor movement stems from the basic idea that the entire criminal justice system is racist, and as pro-criminal anti-victim zealots bought and paid for by George Soros and tech billionaires, they adopt pro-criminal policies. They choose large categories of crimes not to prosecute. In Fairfax County, which is near Washington, D.C., Steve Descano is the rogue prosecutor elected in large part because of George Soros' money. George Soros contributed 75%, more or less, of the total amount of money Steve Descano got to his campaign. Without Soros' money, Steve Descano and these other rogue prosecutors simply would not have been elected. The prosecutor in the American criminal justice system occupies a unique role. Her job is to enforce the criminal law of the state legislature as passed and signed by the governor, or the federal law passed by Congress and signed by the president. Their job is to do justice. It's not to get convictions. We have an adversarial system in our country. You have strong, ethical prosecutors representing the people, and you have strong, zealous criminal defense attorneys representing those charged with crimes. Rogue prosecutors upend that. They erase the wall between prosecution and defense by taking a pro-defense, anti-victim stance, refuse to enforce large swaths of crimes across the book under the guise of prosecutorial discretion. It has nothing to do with prosecutorial discretion. And as a result, crime explodes in the cities where they've been elected. For example, in Boston, Rachel Rollins, the rogue prosecutor of Suffolk County, lists on her website 15 crimes you can commit in Boston. That includes possession with intent to distribute any drug, resisting arrest of a police officer, breaking and entering a house. The irony is that the people who are getting murdered and raped and robbed the most are black and brown, poor people in the inner city. The very policies they promote are the policies that are causing death and destruction and rapes in the very cities they pretend to care about.
If I were a wealthy man, I wouldn't have to work hard. If I were a bitty rich, idle, diddle man, I see my wife, my gold, they're looking like a rich man.
Still learning more about the attack, and we're still processing what it meant to the country and to our lives. So, Hunter, is there a disconnect between the people who were there that day in D.C. and the people who were not? You know, someone like me who only watched it on TV. Will I ever really get it?
You know, I think this was a really unique incident, in part because of when it happened during the pandemic. This was a pre-vaccination moment, and a lot of the DC press corps was, working from home, working remotely, and unless they were the Capitol Hill press corps, like I believe Grace was, or someone like myself who went out to cover the protests, they didn't see this firsthand. And while, we were there on scene, due to the crowds, due to the law enforcement response, cell signals were jammed. So there was a bit of a delay also in that footage getting out.
That's a great point.
And I think that distance, coupled with the fact that we see active attempts to deny the reality of what occurred, have sort of prevented people from realizing what happened that day. And what I've found, I know this for myself, but in talking, there's a bit of an informal network of reporters who've been through it that day and are still coping with that, who are leaning on each other and talking to each other. I also talk to members of Congress, their staffs, and law enforcement, members of the Capitol Police. And we're all still dealing with that and feeling like we need to convey to others how serious it was. I mean, just one example, there are still members of the U.S. Capitol Police out with injuries that they suffered that day.
From a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And some journalists have been candid about PTSD and trauma. We're going to get into that. But on the topic of that day and the cell service and the lack of full awareness, I think it's really important to remember it didn't look as bad on TV as it actually was. And that's not the fault of any television network or any producer or anything. It's just most of the live shots were from far away. We didn't see inside the Capitol the horrible violence, the attacks against police. There were only a few of those videos that came out during the day. It took several days to reckon with just how violent this was, and then several weeks to learn about the security failures and all the rest. So in other words, it was worse than it looked on live TV, and that's why people like you have been having to tell people what really happened.
I mean, one hallmark of post-traumatic stress disorder is sort of having flashbacks and almost eerily clear memories. And for me, the single one that really haunts me is this moment when I was on the phone with my editor. And I was a White House correspondent, so I started that morning covering Trump. I was there at the Ellipse, and, you know, in the final 120 words of his speech, that's when, after over an hour, he told the crowd to march to the Capitol. And
You said, sometimes I'm fine, sometimes I want to sob for hours, sometimes I just want to sleep. So that sounds to me like trauma. That sounds like PTSD. Do you feel like you still experience that?
I do think so.